all, thank you all very much for attending the SOGICA conference and for coming to this session in particular. My name's Moira Dustin and I am one of the researchers on the SOGICA project, which is the team organising this conference. And we have now got, and the registrations are still coming in. We've got more than 600 people registered for this conference, so it's a fantastic event and much bigger than would have been able to have if we'd been having it in Brighton, on the Brighton campus in the UK, as we'd originally hoped. So there's pros and cons of that, advantages and disadvantages. And one of the advantages is that we can have a much more diverse event with people from all over the world. So without further ado, I'm going to crack on and give you a few points of housekeeping before I hand over to our speakers. We've got 3 panelists today, and you can read their full biographical notes on our website, as well as the abstracts for their presentations today. Just in case you're in the wrong place or you want confirmation of what this session is about, this session is about identities, and we're going to be talking about identities in the context of people making claims for asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is what this conference is all about. And we're recording this session, but you don't need to have any concerns about confidentiality if you're a participant, because we are running this as a webinar, which means that you're not visible to any of us or to any of the wider world when we post the link to the recording on our website after the conference. And we're just going to record up to the Q&A part of this session. So after that, all your questions will be private. During the 3 presentations by our wonderful speakers, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to post any questions that you've got. We're each of the speakers will have 15 minutes, and that should leave us about 20 or 25 minutes for discussion of your questions and comments. So please do type them in as we go along. Unfortunately, because there's quite a lot of people taking part in this session, we've got more than 40 at the moment, I probably won't be able to get to all of your questions and comments, so I apologise for that in advance. We've also, we've got, as well as the speakers who I'm going to introduce in a moment, we have got Rose Gordon-Orr, who is working with us as a facilitator on this conference, and for this session in particular, and she is going to be sort of behind the scenes. If anybody has any problems, again, you can use the Q&A function to ask Rose if you need help with anything, and she will try and help you sort out any problems or just any questions. What's the address of the SOGICA website, anything like that. And I think that's about all I need to say in terms of kind of practicalities. So now turning to our presenters, I'm just going to very briefly say who they are before handing over to them. We've got a fantastic expert and experienced panel of speakers today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. We are going to hear from them in the following order. First of all, we're going to hear from Maritza, who is currently completing her PhD in law in Maynooth University, and she's working on transgender asylum claims assessments in the EU context. She's also been a caseworker at the Greek Asylum Service. And then we will hear from Irena Manganini, who is currently working with IOM in Bangladesh, and she's doing a PhD on queer theories in application to international migration law. And finally, we're going to hear from Leticia Vieira da Silva, who is part of the network of lesbian and bisexual women researchers in Brazil. And she has a BA in international relations and is currently working on her MSc in public policy on human rights with a focus on juridical recognition of lesbian refugee demands. And she's also working as a civil society organisation consultant. So that's our fantastic speakers, very briefly introduced, and I am now going to hand over to Marisa. Marisa, over to you.
Hello, everyone. As Moira said, I'm working on the assessment of transgender and gender non-conforming asylum claims. I'm doing doctrinal and social legal analysis, mainly of the Court of Justice of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence, trying to infer some and interpret the doctrine on gender identity and gender expression. I will start by saying some things about the criteria of inclusion to a particular social group for trans asylum seekers, and then I will say some things about the well-founded fear of persecution, which both are terms for fulfilling the refugee definition. So firstly, to the criteria of inclusion in the particular social group, the UNHCR defines particular social group as a group of persons who share a common characteristic other than the risk of being persecuted, or who are perceived as a group by society. The characteristic according to the first test, the protected characteristics test, will often be one which is innate, unchangeable, or which is otherwise fundamental to identity, conscience, or the exercise of one's human rights. According to the jurisprudence, such characteristics refer to gender identity and sexual orientation as well. On the other hand, there are several issues that arise in the identification of transgender, gay, and bisexual individuals as belonging to a particular social group. The sexual minority refugee and the protected characteristic text has indeed some negative aspects which relate, for example, to issues for applicants who are uncertain of their sexuality and gender identity. These applicants have difficulty in proving that their gender identity is fundamental to their identity, and this is the reason why identity-based questions exclude these kinds of applicants, together with the ones who cannot establish a link between their gender expression and identitarian frameworks. For example, gender non-conforming applicants. There are also applicants who experience their gender identity and or expression as a choice and thus cannot present it as a characteristic which is innate and unchangeable. Furthermore, given that sexuality and gender identity and expression can be fluid and not easily categorized, there could be a problem for the applicants to establish it as a protected characteristic. On the other hand, given the foregoing, one could move to the definition of the protected characteristic, including gender identity or expression, as a priori fundamental to conscience and or identity, and establish their fundamentality for the exercise of one's human rights without delegating the burden to the applicants to establish that these characteristics are fundamental for their identity. One needs to examine whether gender identity and expression are protected under current human rights frameworks as fundamental for the exercise of one's rights, as otherwise linked also to the core of human identity and conscience. It is obvious that some applicants will make identitarian claims which have to be assessed as valid. For other applicants, it will be a matter of expression of their conscience and convictions. And for some, it may just be the will to live freely, and one has to see whether that corresponds to a valid claim for exercise of fundamental human rights. The optimistic aspect of the protected characteristic test may be the ability to define a group negatively. For example, one may say that a group of people does not conform to the heteronormative standards of society, and that it is fundamental for them in terms of identity, conscience, and the exercise of human rights. It may also be the case that since refugee status determination asks for the examination of the risk of persecution, one is really on the right side in identifying a group based on its lack of exhibiting certain threats, a fact which potentially has a clear social impact. It is my view that it is the factual background of the social impacts that needs to be examined based on the individual's social location according to their exhibited characteristics that needs to be examined, and not the level of fundamentality of these characteristics. The latter is something that needs to be analytically and legally clear from the start for the authorities, regardless of how the individual experiences it. Credibility tests can be based on a variety of experience and focus mainly on the social location of the individual and not their experience of gender identity and expression. As far as the sexual minority, refugee, and the social perception test goes, there are also issues arising mainly related to the invisibility of a group or individual and the fact that an applicant can have a socially obscure gender identity or expression. On the other hand, there is the possibility to define a group from the persecution that is imputed on them. So, for example, if gender nonconformity cannot be established by reason of an identitarian claim, it can be so that the authorities examine whether this nonconformity is imputed on them by reasons of certain behaviors or certain presentation. Social perception of a group is also closely linked to its persecution, but the reason of the identification of a particular social group has to be different from its persecution. On the other hand, the examination of the social perception of a group, can help us establish the link between persecution and the particular social group requirement. If an applicant is perceived as belonging to a group that is excluded and persecuted, then the definition of the refugee is fulfilled. It is undeniable, though, that as Berg and Milbank have noted after the study of relevant decisions by administrative tribunals in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United Kingdom and the United States, refugee status determination bodies' jurisprudence in the area of transgender asylum claims remains fundamentally incoherent. This condition...
Marisa, could I just ask you to slow down a little bit?
Excuse me.
A little bit more slowly, thank you.
Excuse me.
Sorry to interrupt.
No. This condition calls for the re-evaluation of the legal framework that is applied by refugee status determination bodies and throughout the decision-making process on gender identity-related claims. In light of this, Berg and Milbank argue for a refugee status determination framework that seriously takes into account both gender nonconformity in a particular social context and the applicant's own sense of gender identification. Indeed, this is a valid and positive direction since it allows for the conceptualization of transgender persecution and warns against the erasure of transgender identity. Adding to this, a reconceptualization of the refugee status determination framework on these issues could work towards ensuring the conditions that allow the acknowledgement of different forms of experiencing transgender identity in its various forms of experience and addressing transgender persecution in terms that safeguard both the protection of the applicant's human rights and the human rights dimension of international protection. This is particularly true in gender identity asylum claims. Social stereotyping is widely used for inferences of credibility, and identities are often categorized in medical, psychiatric, or psychological terms, although they are primarily a matter of gender identification. The fixed categories that are most often assumed in refugee status determinations in essence negate the fluidity, personal configuration, and social connotations of gender identity. Instead, they impose other applicant criteria that may not be relevant to the impact of gender nonconformity and fear of persecution as they experience it. As Laviolette neatly points out, it's very dangerous to make assumptions about the lives of particular members of a sexual minority, especially given the diversity of global environment. One also needs to think about gender expression when it's not really linked with identitarian claims. Gender non-conforming applicants will possibly identify as such due to their social location, but may not make clear identity claims. One needs to scrutinize whether gender expression as the expression of one's conscience and personhood is an exercise of fundamental human rights. In addition, certain characteristics may be imputed and lead to persecution. For example, a gender non-conforming applicant can be perceived as gay. One needs to decide whether they are protected as belonging to a group whose sexuality is imputed or a group that is gender non-conforming or both. In my view, questions should take into account the narratives of the applicants and the construction of their personality according to their narratology, and not be exclusively identity-based. There is the risk also that identity and identification-based questions will deeply reflect westernized notions of gender identity and expression. In light of the above, I would propose a framework that is centered around gender non-conformity and the narratives of the applicants around it, whether they are identity or practice-based. As Milbank and Berg suggest, transgender identity has often assumed to be a subset of sexual orientation in the judgments of the jurisdictions examined. This needs to change by clearly introducing gender identity and expression as a protected characteristic. Furthermore, Berg and Milbank suggest that often applicants were deemed credible mainly because they conformed with Western standards of gender dysphoria and visual typologies. The classic narrative, born in the wrong body, played a role, although gender dysphoria is not essential for transgender identity status. Also, transgender identity does not manifest itself with specific external presentation that are stereotypically attributed to one gender or the other. Finally, there are non-binary transgender individuals that do not conform to the psychological profile of experiencing themselves from an early age as the opposite gender. As Berg and Milbank, moreover, as Jordan notes, claimants are being asked to give a narrative account of sexuality or gender identity that they have had limited experience to articulate and may inhabit only uneasily. Transgender applicants may find it difficult to establish both stable identity and gender dysphoria. This is firstly because gender and sexuality can be fluid. Secondly, because such expectations are culturally subscribed. And thirdly, because many applicants form an identity under the conditions of erasure. Additionally, many cultures do not have the language for transgender identity or expression, and some applicants may have limited comprehension of what it means in the Western context. Many times, applicants use homophobic language used by the prosecutors in order to describe their protected threats. Other times, actual or imputed sexual orientation is used in order to present the evidence of persecution, since there is more available data from country of origin information on sexual orientation. One must be aware of the complications between gender sexuality, gender identity, and expression, and be able to identify the nature of an heteronormative and a patriarchal society that persecutes transgender and gender non-conforming applicants, since gender roles are based on a heterosexual orientation, which implies a refusal on the part of the applicants to behave in ways dictated by their biological sex and social classification. In the 2018 article, Nasser Eddin, Abu Asab, and Greatrig proposed a shift from sexual orientation and gender identity protection to sexual practice and gender performance protection, which would allow for a less identity-based framework of refugee status determination. That indeed is a valid point. On the other hand, it excludes cases where identity, practice, and performance formation are prohibited due to the restrictive and oppressive environment where the applicants come from. According to the above authors, one must move beyond identity category as those presented in the LGBTQI rights framework in refugee status determination.
Marisa, could I just say only 2 or 3 minutes left if you could start winding up. Thank you.
The latter ones often fail to encompass the local context and the intersection between gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and religion. As Johnson and Repta note, gender roles can be described as social norms or rules and standards that dictate different interests, responsibilities, opportunities, limitations, and behaviors for men and women. And that must be evident in the narratives of the claimants, whether it is a conscious or reflected upon fact or not. Interrogating just identity category is deficient, since some applicants may make identity claims, but other non-normative individuals possibly not. According to the above authors, it is also very important to identify the binarism reflected in the gender oppression, which makes individuals abide by the roles that are prescribed to them and be at risk when they do not, The binary reflected in complementary and mutually exclusive notions of femininity and masculinity is, according to the article, the starting point of the discrimination against gender non-conforming individuals, and it is reflected on gender performance as opposed to gender identity, since it is exhibited in the way people dress, behave, style their hair, and speak. Gender performance indeed moves away from fixed and unchangeable identities. On the other hand, there is the possibility that we conceptualize identity as something fluid and fundamental at the same time and complement it with gender expression, whether that is connected to an identity claim or not. In that way, refugee status determination could provide more protection both to transgender applicants that, for example, are in the closet, and gender non-conforming applicants applicants that view their self-expression as not necessarily deriving from a particular gendered self-perception. Finally, what is needed, in my view, is a framework that protects identities and expressions that are non-normative and correspond to the sexual minority characteristics of the applicant, whether these are externalized or reflected upon or not. In that context, the practice of refugee status determination body would seek to identify to what extent sexual and gender identity are fundamental for the applicants in order to assess them as a particular social group becomes less relevant. It is my view that would be a positive direction, since this line of interrogating requires westernized notions of self-awareness on the part of the applicants, and it views sexual orientation and gender identity as ad hoc relevant and fundamental. On the other hand, as Nasser al-Din, Abu Assab, and Creatric argue, it is very important to acknowledge the fact that the expectations for gender performances in fact vary across cultures, classes and nationalities. So it is important as well to examine the social location of the individuals and the gender non-conformity within their prevalent gender ideology. Non-normativity is very important to identify a particular social group without exclusively relying on identity claims. The distance assumed between a heteronormative and patriarchal society and the non-normative individual can shed light in the determination of their belonging to a particular social group and can largely fall under the category of non-conforming identity and or expression. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Marisa. That was fascinating. Absolutely.
I was very quick in the start. I'm really sorry for that. I always do that. I'm sorry. I hope that people were able to follow at least after you interrupted me.
You crammed a lot in and it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. And can I remind people as we go along to please use the Q&A box to type any questions so that I can pull them together at the end. And without further ado, I will hand over to Irena. Irena, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a tiny thing before I start. You said I'm doing a PhD, which I'm not yet doing a PhD, but hopefully soon.
So sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'll try to share my screen. I'll see if it works. Yeah, because I have a presentation. Voila. Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so sorry. Yeah. So thank you, Maria, for the introduction, and Marisa for the presentation. And it's incredible how much mine will build on yours. So it was a very insightful for me as well. My presentation is on the refugee status determination of transgender asylum seekers, and I will attempt a queer critique of the whole system. Below is my email in case any panelist has any question. So I'll just gonna dive directly, since we don't have much time, I'm gonna dive directly to the research question, which is how can a queer analysis, meaning through queer legal theories, a queer analysis of the refugee status determination process of transgender asylum seekers help in showing us the way forward to rethink the global asylum system, which is a big question for 15 minutes. We'll try. So my presentation will first quickly define UNHCR's definition of transgender, so show the law as it is, and then what actually goes wrong during this application, all the patterns of misinterpretation, and why I think this happened. And yeah, not only me. So a brief queer analysis of the topic. So the UNHCR definition is very long, which for me is to be welcome, and I'm gonna highlight just a very few points on why I don't think the problem is in the law, but rather in the way it is understood. For example, a very important point from the UNHCR is that transgender is a gender identity, not a sexual orientation. A transgender individual may be heterosexual, gay, lesbian, or bisexual. I may add pansexual and any other sexual orientation. And as Marisa already was saying, this is very often misunderstood. The difference is really not clear yet in many asylum contexts, and in so many cases I analyzed in my work, gender identity is considered a subset of sexual orientation, which really leads to a big difficulty in finding relevant jurisprudence for this kind of research. Because as Marisa again was saying, many people are imputed the homosexual orientation, and that's how their claim is screened rather than through, the gender identity ground. Something else to be welcome, I think, is that is the highlight that not fitting within accepted binary perception of being male and female, they may be perceived as threatening social norms and values. This is very relevant, I think, because, and it's a key point of what at the end will be my main claim, because this basically opened up for the whole, for the concept of gender nonconformity from the UNHCR side. So, and given how much authority UNHCR has in this, it is really important. And it also introduced the social element of threatening norms and values, which is relevant especially for membership of particular social group assessments. However, there is something extremely worrying, I feel, in this definition, which is this completely unnecessary term that was inserted, which is individuals may choose to express their chosen gender only at certain times in environments where they feel safe. And gender, I mean, however one wants to think about it, but genders are, it's not something you choose, and it's something you feel, have, identify with, and having this, you know, term in the refugee definition kind of opens up a very risky door for concealment reasoning by adjudicators, meaning for whomever doesn't know what that means, you can choose not to be like that, so there's no real risk of persecution, basically. All in all, it's a very broad definition, but the real issue arises when this needs to be applied, so during the refugee status determination process. And there are many very interesting interventions in the Sojica conference on the different parts, so we'll very quickly go through what happens, like what goes wrong, kind of, you know, the patterns of what goes wrong in transgender claimants adjudication. And I trust that everybody, or most of our participants, are familiar with the refugees definition. So, you know, on the one well-founded fear, trans people's claims are trans people not granted refugee status because they're said they can conceal, for example, conceal their gender identity, or because there is no mention of, in the country of origin information, there is no mention of transgender identities criminalization, so it's assumed that everything is fine, or because they disclose their identity at a later stage, not at the very first stage of the asylum assessment, so they're not really scared because otherwise they would, you know, they would say it straight away. Or for example, when it comes to persecution, again, criminalization, if country X does not explicitly criminalize transgender activities, whatever that might mean, then it means that, you know, the country doesn't really have any problem with transgender identities. Okay, causal link, this is quite complicated, but it is thought that their activities, that they're not persecuted for reasons of what is actually trivial activities that relate, I mean, this relates mostly to sexual orientation claims, but the nexus requirement is sometimes not considered to be met. People are not believed, quite simply, maybe this is, people are not believed to be what they claim to be or who they claim to be, or otherwise they are told that, you know, they could easily move to a more accepting / tolerant place in their country, so there's no real need for them to be granted international protection in the country where they're asking for it. So these are like the patterns, and again, these are being examined by very expert panelists in the conference. I wanted to rather stress why I think this happens. So how do we explain all this? And I tried to explain this through, again, using this strand of critical theory called queer theory, which is usually, I mean, the beginning of which is usually associated with names such as Butler or Sedgwick, Michel Foucault, kind of, which is a critical tool of analysis that offers resistance to regimes of the normal. And from that, we go to queer legal theory, which I associate with the work of Diane Otto from the University of Melbourne. And let me read this because I think it's a very clear explanation of what queer legal theory aims at doing. Queer legal theory provides a means to examine the structural assumptions and conceptual architecture that underpin the normative framework and operation of international law. The critical insights of queer theory can offer new insights into how international law works to reinforce unequal relations of power resources and knowledge, and how this might be resisted. I find this extremely fascinating because it really gives a framework through which we can see international and perhaps not just resist it, but you know, change it, contribute to its ideological and systemic change. And I base myself on the concept of power structures, which is you know, which you can read on the screen. And I identified what I think are the three main power structures behind the global asylum system, which like are the cause behind what we just saw on all the patterns of misinterpretation when assessing queer claims. And I identified three. They're not the only ones, but I think they are the ones that are the most pressing, which are the gender binary, the Western cultural supremacy, and the concept of border. I'm going to discuss each of them. I have no clue how many minutes I have left. I hope I'm fine. So when it comes to gender binary, the gender binary is the belief that there exists only two opposite and complementing genders, which is seen as a consequence to the belief that there exist only two biological sexes. It's a concept that still shapes most social interactions around the world, and international law is no exception, being profoundly binary. Even if the idea of not identifying with your own gender is starting to be accepted, you still have to be or become a man or be or become a woman. You still have to kind of fit in one of these two categories. And this is problematic in general, I believe, but even more so when it comes to trans asylum seekers. Because in a system as strict as the asylum one, where you receive protection only if you fall into certain strictly defined categories, the binary conception of gender harms trans people because it harms those who do not fit. It excludes them, or that are not seen as fitting, and it forces those who want to be granted protection to exaggerate their behaviors and show that they, quote unquote, pass, which for those who don't know mean that they look like and behave like the gender they identify with. Constraining trans identities into clear expectation of what it means to belong to their claimed identity, leaving no option than A or B, male or female, simply basically fortifies the power system that they are themselves fleeing from. When it comes to Western cultural supremacy, basically all the jurisprudence analyzed through my research comes from Western jurisdictions, simply because Western countries have so far been the receivers of the majority of asylum claims based on transgender identity. And the downside of this, of course, is that people will often be assessed following a Western idea of what queer means and ought to look like. And this is problematic. There are two very problematic underlying assumptions in this, which is one, that these assumptions will be based on ethnocentric gender and sexuality ideas and beliefs. And this cultural supremacy-induced belief of the adjudicators that the country of origin culture, the claimant's country of origin culture, is the source of persecution itself. So basically, on one hand, trans people will be assessed, and other queer claimants will be assessed following the usually very superficial idea of how queer people look like and behave, which will necessarily be informed by the adjudicator's Western cultural background. And on the other hand, the assessment will be often based on the perception of how intolerant or underdeveloped their countries of origin are. An example of this that I was quite shocked when I read it was that of, I believe it was in the Netherlands, I didn't write it down, from a minor, or maybe he was a minor when he fled. Basically, this person was found, he was a Pakistani national. He was found in bed with his boyfriend at the time, and the dad came in, found them in bed together. And at the beginning, he got very angry, and then he prompted the son to leave the country. And this whole story was believed, was not deemed credible because we all know how intolerant Pakistan is towards homosexual relationships. So it's very likely that the dad had reacted that way. So this, for me, is a very strong example of even Western arrogance towards, other people's culture. So basically, the narrative of power here is quite evident. Trans and other queer claimants are in a position of inferiority, which results from their being non-Western and having their life and identity screened through an unfamiliar lens in which they do not and cannot recognize themselves. And this is very harmful to the trans community. Like when adjudicators disbelieve adult versions of trans people or third gender people or any gender non-conformity people, when they do not realize that there exist many non-Western forms of transgender, or when they meet claims favorably only if the claimant has undergone surgery, for example. This is extremely harmful and needs to be assessed perhaps through more trainings and so. And again, I hope I have time. The third power structure that maybe is actually the most relevant, or at least the harshest one, that transgender and the gender non-conforming claimants clash against, is that of border, which I intend not only as physical barrier, but also as a separation, as my territory, which is not yours, as this basically ideological construct that generates aleatory identities. Because we have to avoid forgetting that transgender asylum seekers are actually asylum seekers in the first place. They are in a condition of extreme vulnerability also because they are asking for asylum, because they are foreigners turning to another state for protection, which is in itself a very extreme condition of powerlessness. And seen through queer theories, the border is the physical representation of state power, and it's complementary to its systemic representation, which is heteronormativity. Basically, conjugal heterosexual family units and their offspring grant the continuation of the nation state. While
Lorena, could I ask you to wrap up in a couple of minutes?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. So basically, shortly, the heteronormativity is the way the nation state continues itself. And as a counterpart, the border is the other key feature that the nation state has to control who belongs and who does not. Trans asylum seekers challenge both these constitutive elements of the nation state: the border, citizenship, territory on one hand, and heteronormativity on the other hand. So they're extremely dangerous when it comes to the continuation of the concept and of the nation state. And I believe offer very interesting insights for queer theories, no borders advocacy effort. To conclude, I think, sorry for the telling image, I think the way forward is what we can describe as queering international law, which does not mean to adjust the current system as to include more. For example, finding avenues for queer asylum seekers to fit in a small box, basically, where power holders accept to welcome them. The risk to avert is for queer itself to go normative, but rather the key is using this as golden opportunity, I think, to rethink the whole structure of the asylum system, to open up possibilities of radical new systemic relations that are not based on gender binaries or sexual hierarchies, not based on an imposition of the West over non-West or of the citizen over the non-citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irena. That was fascinating. And I won't say any more. I will pass straight over to Leticia, who is last but certainly not least of our speakers. And after that, we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Leticia.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'd like first to thank the organization of this event in the figure of Dr. Moira Dustin for all care and organization since the beginning. I'd like to apologize in advance for my English because it will be my first English presentation, so I am a few anxious. And I will now share my screen. If you can confirm you are seeing okay. So as Marisa and Irene have talked about some important points, I think important points about eligibility, I will, if you don't mind, I will jump some slides because we have a short time. but my research talks about the challenges in the eligibility of lesbians as asylum claimants based on based on sexual orientation. It makes part of my thesis research in the program of the master degree in public policy on human rights here in Brazil. Um, yes, so the goals is discuss the gendered assumptions to legal recognition, the colonized assumptions about what is citizenship, sovereignty, legal and illegal, and how these, in the words of Rachel Lewis, what we can know like deportable people. So as methodology, I chose cases from UK since 2005 is to 2016 and academic literature. The countries of origin is Jamaica, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Albania, Uzbekistan, and India. I don't mention each case, but we have time afterwards, we can discuss, and I can make available the lawsuits. They are all available in a platform from United Nations High Commissariat for Refugees. And if you don't mind, I will jump the first assumptions, the first comments about gender, state, and refugee, because I think my colleagues talk very well about these points. So just the construction, the building of a particular social group. I use a Brazilian lawyer called Liliana Jubilut that offered 3 elements to think the shape of particular social group. She talks about self-perception, social perception, and persecution agent. Self-perception, it means how it can be a problem in the asylum claimants, because if the asylum claimant does not identify themselves like LGBTI, that is a Western concept, you can have a problem to recognize, to build this Western coherence about the frame of refugee and the frame of sexuality. I don't discuss deeply the social perception, but I know in this conference it will be another work. I don't know if it will be today or tomorrow, but it's a good opportunity to deep this discussion. And the persecution agent I will discuss later in some slides. And another important question is the building of a well-founded fear of persecution, as Irene and Mariah have said. So I decided to show you the sexual orientation laws in the world. This is a map of from ILGA. Here in this map, you can, I don't necessarily follow the slides because I'm a few worried about the time, and I'll try to speak in a clearly way. But you can see, in my point of view, 2 interesting comments. First, an imaginary line between North Global and South Global. So you can see the colonial heritage, because most of the countries that meant and criminalized the same sexual relationships between adults maintained in the South Global. And like Dr. Moira does the comments in a work from 2018, this can reinforce new colonial agendas. So in the construction of causal nexus, sometimes implicitly the speech of asylum claim can have some assumptions about civilization or savagery. So you can reinforce this Western perspective. Let me know just if I forgot something. I have another comment about this map, because 18 countries out of the 68 are, have laws that criminalize specifically relationships between men. And I argued that this does not represent connivance. On the contrary, it could mean invisibility on the relations between women. So it's not a relationship there where we don't have a male figure intermediating is not legitimated. So this is a question. So what I found out in the research, I chose 7 cases from these countries, and my inquiry questions were: how can compulsory heterosexuality influence lesbian asylum claims? And I use the term technologies of refuge because I think the bureaucracies and the quotidian activities that shape these that shape the refugee. So the lawsuits, the figure of the decision maker in general, that in general is a male, is a man. So how these technologies can produce the portable bodies by this division of inside and outside, who is legal, who is illegal, and how these technologies can frame a meaning of lesbian refugee. As Spiker Bauer says, these refugee, these politics of refugee produce a truth of sexuality and a truth of refugee. So I talk about a double framing in terms of Judith Butler. So a double framing for what can mean lesbian and what can mean refugee. So finally, why lesbians flee? So we can say they can flee the Western and colonized stereotypes about lesbians. So for example, I analyze in case from Jamaica when I saw lesbians suffer not only the private violences and the violences from the criminalization, but the violence about the perspectives, the pre-assumptions that the decision maker have about these asylum claimants. So for example, in this case from Jamaica, the processual revision alleges that the appellant is educated, sophisticated, and articulated. So they put these characteristics in the lawsuits like something that deserve highlight. It's an example to Western perspectives and about the asylum claimants. A similar case occurred with a couple of Indian women in 2015. It was another case I analyzed. And I talked too about the expected narrative about persecution, well-founded fear, and sexuality. I argue that these points, that shape the 1951 convention, they concern more the assumptions of the decision makers than the possibilities of existence and resistance in different lands and multiple cultural contexts. Because we have cases when the decision maker does not consider that someone is lesbian because she does not go to nightclubs, for example. And another point I consider interesting here was the centrality of the body in the refugee. It was an interesting point I found out in my research because I saw the need to prove the persecution by physical tests and narratives about torture in prison. So how the narratives need to be coherent with the expectations of the law and the right and the law. Psychological tests that prove trauma experiences, like the case from Albania. The use of images, audios, and testimonials from sexual partners to prove someone is lesbian. And I use the perspective from Hane Blank. She offers an incredible perspective about the inexistence of a straight gen, because the law are always searching proofs to say that the homosexuality and the lesbians exist. But anyone asks a straight gen. So the heterosexuality is the role, is the norm, and all the possibilities of existence and life experience is different from that can be proved. I used to an author from Guatemala called Dorotea Grijalba. She will talk about the lesbian body as a political land, because we have a lot of violence we will pass by this body, like forced marriage, like corrective rape, like heterosexuality, compulsory heterosexuality. And all these elements will produce, in the words of Didier Fassin, the precarious truth of asylum and the truth from the body. So this truth will be produced by biological, they will use biological tests to try to prove this sexuality. And another point I consider interesting analyzing these lawsuits was the role of the time. I analyzed seven lawsuits, but it was interesting seeing, because the time plays an important role in the building of causal nexus. For example, in a case when the appellant adjudicator points out the fear of return and be persecuted based on 1951 convention to claim asylum. So they will, in the building of causal nexus, the adjudicator will say, this asylum claimant cannot return to your country of your origin, because if she returns, she will be persecuted. So the future will occupy an important role in this nexus, in the causal nexus, and this is protected by the on the 1951 convention. But in some cases, the respondent, I mean, the state does not respect this criterion. On the other hand, the state many times use the past to allege, based on the lack of previous persecution in the country of your origin, that the asylum claimant can return and even live discreetly. So here, I think my other colleague talked about late disclosure. I use the perspective from Jana Vessels about late disclosure and all the questions that come with the heterosexuality, the compulsory heterosexuality, because I argue that required life discretion, required life discreetly in the country of your origin for women can represent forced marriage, have children. So all the straight roles, it's not simply return, come back home and live discreetly. And
yeah,
to talk,
can I ask you to wind up in a minute or two, please?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So to finish, I'll talk about more challenges to legal recognition. I consider as a challenge the androcentric perspective of refugee law, and as consequence, more invisibility of lesbian existences. They can be different in different lands and cultural contexts. I use the term in Portuguese because I consider the translation is not the best, but I use the concept of política do esquecimento, created by Tânia Navarro Swain. This is a Brazilian historian. And I translated like policy of forgetting, but it's not forgetting. She argues that in the Occidental history, women were not forgotten, but erased. The protagonism, the female protagonism were erased from the history. I consider the belief in discretion reasoning a problem, because for lesbian women that could mean follow all the sexual norms, as I have said. The later disclosure, the same thing. And the truth of sexuality. So I think I almost finishing. Like recommendations, it's urgent to provide a gendered perspective to refuge law. The recognition of lesbians' existence requires consider that the personnel is not only political, but international, as says Cynthia Enloy. Listen to the voices of lesbian women refugees, because we are talking, so we need to listen. And the discretion reasoning, I'd like just to finish with this image from Sarah Hegazi, because she was a Egyptian activist, lesbian. She was a refugee. She passed away in the last month. So I consider this presentation need to count with a little tribute to her. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much for those fantastic presentations.